As the manager of our district's mental health program, I have spent the last year on an absolute mission to train teachers and staff throughout our school district about the warning signs of suicide and mental health. And as I walk into the classrooms and I walk into rooms to teach teachers, to show them and explain to them about the warning signs of suicide and mental health, I can feel the anxiety, I can feel the tension and the worry in the room. And I think so much of it, in my opinion, has to do because of the responsibility that these teachers feel towards these topics. But I think that there's also this thought that maybe creeps into their head about, what can I possibly do? What power do I have as a teacher or as a staff member to help a young person who is struggling with mental health? Well, my message today is very simple. And that is that you don't have to be a mental health professional. You don't have to be a therapist to make an impact on a young person's life. Actually, my message is that all you really need to do, in my opinion, to make an impact on the wellness of our youth is to make an attempt to connect. So as I explain mental health to teachers, and school staff, I often use this picture. And it's a simple picture that kind of helps to describe mental health, the mental health issues that our youth are dealing with. So I use this picture of a tree because of the symbolism. And there's three important parts of this tree that I like to share with teachers. There is the most visible part of the tree. There is the part of the tree that makes the first impression, right? So when you look at a tree, the first part that you see is the branches, the leaves. It's the vibrant part of the tree, the part of the tree that stands out. The second part of the tree is the trunk. And now through that trunk flows oxygen and water, and it keeps those leaves at the top vibrant and green. But then there is the most important part of the tree, which are the roots. And that to me is the most important part of mental health. So let me explain. As I talked about the leaves and the branches, that actually represents what we see on the outside. So in terms of when a child is experiencing any kind of mental health issue, what you see are mostly behaviors. You don't really know the reason why that child is feeling the way they're feeling. You don't really know what the root is. When you see a child at school, most of the time, all we see is behavior. So what I'm talking about I'm talking about students who are suicidal. I'm talking about students who are self-injuring. I'm talking about students that are trying to numb their pain through the use of drugs or alcohol, for example. I'm talking about students who have anger problems, right? And who sometimes end up taking out their anger out in schools with other peers or other people. But ultimately, it's just behavior. That doesn't tell the story at all about what's really happening with that child or that youth. If we go another layer deeper, we look at the trunk, and the symbolism between the trunk is the emotion. It represents the feelings or emotions that are driving those behaviors. You see, there's a reason why young people behave the way they do. There's a reason why sometimes they self-injure. There's a reason sometimes why they drink and do drugs to numb their pain. And sometimes those reasons or those emotions or those feelings have to do with depression. They have to do with anxiety. They have to do with unresolved grief, for example. But then we go to the deepest level, which is represented by the roots. And much like the roots of the tree, this represents those hidden stories. It represents those intimate stories that young people have gone through in their lives. And those stories are stories that sometimes are hidden in their hearts, they're hidden in their mind, and they remain secrets. Secrets that, in my opinion, are waiting to be discovered by adults at times. What are some of those traumas or roots that I'm talking about? It can mean a million different things, but ultimately, what I've learned about our school district is that there are a lot of young people that are dealing with issues of abuse, that are dealing with issues of trauma, displacement, divorce. There's so many issues that affect our youth. And that to me is the most important part. But ultimately, my message with this slide, and the reason I show it to teachers, is to let them know that first of all, nobody expects for you to be a therapist, nobody expects for you to be a counselor, and much less will you have the honor necessarily to get to know what those roots are. But you know what? You don't have to. You don't have to know what those roots are to nourish those roots. The only thing that I'm suggesting today that adults do is make the effort to connect. There are so many stories that have made me who I am today. I can tell a million stories. I love telling stories. It's part of my culture. It's part of my family and what we do when we sit around the table. There is, for example, the story of the stolen pig. The story of the stolen pig is a story about my Asian grandfather, great-grandfather, who at some point impregnated my great-grandmother and stole her pig. I wish I could go into details, but ultimately, it's a story about depression. It's a story about grief. It's a story about abandonment. It's a story about disappointment. And that's actually the story of my family. It's a story that affected my family for generations, and it still impacts our family till this day. There's the story of the train tracks, and that picture that you see up there are the actual train tracks whereby my father would pick up family members and relatives that would come from Mexico to the United States to go up north to work field jobs. My father would pick up these people upon arriving. Now, their journey was very strenuous. I need to point that out. These people would cross the Arizona border, jump on a train, walk the desert many miles before they got on that train, by the way. And then once that train finally made their way to the city of Colton, my father would pick them up, take them home, where my mother would start to play nurse. You see, these people, because they would walk so many miles in the desert, they would have blisters on their feet, they would be dehydrated, they would be hungry. So my mother would begin to nurse them, to feed them, to rehydrate them before they can be sent off for the next part of their journey. The beautiful part about that story, by the way, is that now as a mental health manager, my mental health offices are literally across the street from those railroad tracks. So every day that I come to work, I get to be reminded about my story, about my history. There's a bunch of other stories, but the story that I really want to focus on today is called the story of the boot. The story of the boot is ultimately a humongous part of who I am. It's a humongous part of my identity. The story of the boot has to do with the fact that, so I was born in this country. At the age of 1 or 2, I was moved to Mexico. The arrangement that my parents had was that it was basically the way that my parents decided to make ends meet. It was too expensive for us to live here with my dad, so my parents decided, you know what? My father stayed back to work in a factory job in San Bernardino, and my mother and I and my 2 older brothers moved back to Mexico. Now, this arrangement worked for a few years, but after 6, 7 years, it just started to get really, really old because we missed our dad. We missed our father so much. We would only see him maybe once or twice a year. It wasn't working for us. So my brothers and I lobbied, I'd like to think. We organized together and we said, you know what, Dad? We need to see you. We want to spend more time with you. Can you please bring us back together? So luckily, my dad listened to us. And here we go on this journey to the United States. Now, ironically, I was an American citizen, but my brothers and my mother were not. Neither was my father. They did not have the residency. So the ironic part of coming to the United States is that I had to cross the border illegally, even though I was an American citizen. So needless to say, as we're crossing the border, we had to cross through this tunnel on the border of Arizona. And as we're crossing this tunnel, it was a drainage tunnel, so there was a lot of water and a lot of mud. And the other really important part about that story is that as a child, I only wore exclusively cowboy boots in Mexico. I didn't know how to wear tennis shoes. My cowboy boots were my Air Jordans. They were my Nikes, my Reeboks, my whatever, my Adidas. I could do anything. I can climb trees, I can run, I can play tag, I can play baseball, you name it. There isn't anything that I couldn't do in my boots. So as we're walking through this tunnel, I see and I come across this amazing puddle of mud. I was 8 years old. I couldn't help myself. So I see this puddle of mud, I stick my foot in there, and right away I noticed something wrong. I said, uh-oh, this isn't fun anymore. And I was tugging and tugging, and my foot was basically stuck. My boot was stuck in the mud. Now, as we were crossing the border, we were on a time. We were on a time crunch. We needed to move. We needed to move fast. My mother was urging me to hurry. What are you doing, Toño? Hurry up. We got to go. We got to go. There were 2 gentlemen on the sides, by the way, of the entrance of this tunnel that looked a little sketchy. So it was kind of scary. Needless to say, I had to hurry, yank my foot out the mud, and get going. But as I yanked my foot out that mud, or my boot, it got stuck. It got stuck in the mud, and we were in such a time crunch that I couldn't retrieve it. So needless to say, I had to cross and walk the rest of the way on one boot, limping across this tunnel until we got to the other side. The beautiful thing is that we made it. And then soon after, my mom took me to Payless, and she bought me my first pair of XJ 900s. Those shoes gave me rashes on my feet, I feel like. They didn't work for me, but needless to say, I didn't wear boots anymore. As a matter of fact, it took me 22 years to buy me another pair of cowboy boots. But the symbolism behind that is that a piece of me stayed behind. That's such a symbolic experience for me. That boot that's probably still there in that tunnel, in that puddle of mud, I feel like a piece of my identity stayed behind. A piece of me was left behind, my culture, my identity, my roots. You see, the process of assimilation was very difficult for me. I never felt like I was American enough. I never felt like I was Mexican enough in this country. And so much of it had to do with the discrimination that I faced. I was called names, I was called a wetback, I was called an illegal alien, which was really confusing, by the way, because as a kid, as an 8-year-old, the only aliens that I knew about were those little flying saucer aliens that were green. And so when I would look at my skin, I would be really confused. I'm thinking, I'm not green, I'm brown, but there must be something wrong with me. Needless to say, it really affected my self-esteem. All the discrimination, all the name calling, it even got to the extreme that my mother had this little scrubbing rock in her shower, and she used it probably to scrub her heels. And I would use that little rock sometimes to try to scrub the brown of my skin because I thought that it would maybe make me a little bit lighter and I wouldn't be made fun of in school. Ultimately, this was a really difficult experience, and it was also a very lonely experience that led to symptoms of depression. I wouldn't have known that as a child, but now as an adult, I can absolutely recognize that I was depressed. I was sad, I was lonely, I was hopeless, and most importantly, my ability to dream was absolutely stumped. It was absolutely affected. I had such a hard time dreaming about the future. I was only able to think about that moment. We fast forward to middle school. I made it through elementary school, thank God. When I got to middle school, I was just like every other kid. I considered myself a very average student when I first started middle school. As a matter of fact, I didn't really like to stand out. I wanted to be that kid that would just be in the shadows. I did not like speaking in front of class. I was very self-conscious because my thought was, if I speak, they're going to discover my thick accent, and then here we go with the name calling and all the teasing. So, for the most part, I just kind of blended in the classroom. I used to sit all the way in the back and just blend in. So one day, as I'm sitting there in class, minding my own business, Mr. Hammerquist, I'll never forget this man. My 7th grade math teacher, Mr. Hammerquist, points to me and he says, "Hey, I need to talk to you after school." Immediately, I get nervous. I start sweating. I start checking myself for gum. I start wondering, did I turn in my homework? Did I say something bad in class? Something must have happened. I must have done something wrong. So 3 or 5 minutes before the end of class is when he called me out, and they were eternal. I could not stand the thought of waiting 3 minutes. It was so eternal to me. But needless to say, the bell rang, and Mr. Hammerquist approaches me. Upon approaching me, Mr. Hammerquist completely throws me for a loop. You see, I thought I was in trouble. I thought I had done something wrong. But first of all, as he approaches me, he just greets me. "Hey, how you doing? By the way, I've looked up your grades, and they're pretty good. Good for you. And you know what? I noticed that you sit in the back of the class, and you don't make noise, and you don't disrupt my class, so I'm really thankful for that." So I'm looking at him thinking, okay, well, you're welcome. I'm a little confused at this point. But then he goes on and asks me some very basic questions. Mr. Hammerquist says, "Hey, by the way, tell me a little bit about yourself. Where do you come from? Tell me about your family. Tell me about your parents and your brothers. How many brothers and sisters do you have? Where do you live?" He asked me some basic questions. And upon answering his questions, he said some words that, as simple as they are, have absolutely changed my life. He says, "Wow, so let me get this straight. You're bilingual, you come from a beautiful culture, and you have a loving family." I was so confused. He said, "I know and I have a good feeling that you're going to go to college one day." That confused me even more. You see, a child whose self-esteem is in the dumps, a child who doesn't allow himself to dream because they are so depressed, can't think past tomorrow. But here comes Mr. Hammerquist telling me that, first of all, I had strengths. He helped me to reframe my insecurities into strengths. But he did 3 things that I think are so critical. He pulled me out of the shadows of the classroom. He acknowledged that I existed by just having a conversation with me. And then he gave me hope for the future. And those words have resonated in me for 27 years now. I know it's such a simple story, but the impact and the timing of those words meant the world to me. Those words have affected me so much. His influence has meant so much to me that it actually caused me to now go into the helping field. I am now a mental health manager, and as a manager, I teach other up-and-coming mental health professionals on how to connect with other kids. I get to teach others about their power to connect. So in closing, my message is very simple. You know, Mr. Hammerquist never knew my roots. He didn't really know my stories. He didn't know much of the pain that I was going through as a young man. But he dared to connect. He dared to at least make me feel like I was relevant in his classroom. And that is the message that I would like to send to people. And that process and that action allowed me to begin a process of honoring myself as a human being. So in honor of that little boy, I'm wearing today the very same boots that I bought 22 years after I lost my first pair of boots. So in closing, I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to Mr. Hammerquist. I want to say thank you to teachers, to adults, and people that have a loving heart and who take that little bit of time in their day to acknowledge kids. And remember, you don't have to do therapy. You don't have to be a professional to impact a young person's life. But just know that your kind words and your gestures can go a long ways towards emotional wellness. Thank you.